All right, my name is Koen. I want to say thank you so much for being here. And we want to talk about this idea of out-of-context problems. And so when we start thinking about this idea of an out-of-context problem, one of the things that we should think about is what are some of the things that are outside of our sphere of influence, right? What are some of the things that might be outside of our context? I think Ronald Reagan really presented this idea of an out-of-context problem really well with a word picture that he painted around this idea of aliens coming to the planet. And when he talked about aliens coming to the planet, what he really wanted us to think about is how we might focus on our similarities a lot more than we would concentrate on our differences, because this outside entity would propose for us some out of context problems. So would those so-called aliens be friendly? Would they require us to act or interact with each other as human beings differently in order to either accept this new entity or to actually fight against it? And so when Ronald Reagan talked about aliens landing on the planets, and he actually said, you know, aren't they among us today? And I think he was really trying to talk about ideologies, alien ideologies, or alien ways of thinking. And aren't they things that actually make us more human and more connected, so to speak? And so when we talk about this idea of out-of-context problems, that's essentially what we're dealing with. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about a couple of concepts. One is a paradigm. We'll talk about the illusion of knowledge. We'll talk about, again, this idea of an out-of-context problem and how to actually develop cultural competence around this idea that there are things that we're not exposed to or aware of. And then lastly, we'll talk about some steps that you can take to become or to create things that can be added into your particular context. All right. So, so let's go into the first part of this lecture, which is really asking the simple question. And this is a question that I came to as I was really trying to understand human behavior. And so I typically ask this question: why is it that and actually this looks more like a moose than it does a deer, but why is it that deer get hit by cars? Why is it that deer get hit by cars? And you know, that sounds like a whimsical question, but we really have to think about the answer to that question. And so the question is, again, why do deer get hit by cars? And lots of people say they get stunned by the lights. Other people say that we've built roadways in the middle of their historic migration patterns, right? Other people will say that they are surprised by cars. And one of the things that I've really thought about in terms of how to answer that question is I started to wonder, do deer know what cars are? Do they even know what a car is? You know, and I go back to Bambi or the yearling, and I didn't see Bambi's father, Buck, really teach Bambi, that's a Ford F-150. Be careful with that one. Or Dawn, Bambi's mom, saying, you know what, that's a Prius. You don't have to worry about that car, right? Or a smart car. So that did not happen. That did not happen. But what we do know is that oftentimes deer get caught in the headlights. And I imagine that there's a conversation between deer going like this. Hey Gladys, look at this thing. Come here. Look at this thing. What is it? Let's go see. Boom. Right. And I'm just joking, but I can see the fact that deer don't necessarily know what cars are. And so when we talk about that that kind of experience. What we're saying is that cars are outside of the context of deer, right? They may recognize, it's big danger or whatnot, but I would suggest that in many ways they're not even clear. I don't know if there's a word in deer for car, right? So when we talk about this idea of a context and an out of context problem, first let's talk about our context. And I would submit to you that context is everything. It's everything. If you understand the context by which people are coming from, then you can understand why they behave the way they do, because they are adapting to their context. And we'll talk about what that adaptation is in just a second. So first, let's talk about context being everything. So this is the circle of all human knowledge. Okay, it's a little melodramatic, right? But let's say this is the circle of all human information. And what I want you to do is to draw a circle similar to this. And I want you to cut yourself a piece of pie relative to the size of what you know of everything that there is to know. All right? So cut yourself a piece of pie relative to the size of what you know of everything there is to know. All right? So I'll do mine right now. So this is a dramatization of what I know. I really don't know that much of everything there is to know. But there are some things that I know, I'm aware of, right? So I know that all things considered, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I know that that 2 + 2 is 4. I know how to dress myself, right, and how to drive to a location. So there are tons of things that I know. So what I'd like you to do now is to cut yourself a piece of pie relative to the size of what you know you do not know. Right? Now, someone might say, well, that's the rest of the pie. I want to caution you on that. Let's think of this particular piece of pie as the things that you are aware of that you do not know. For example, I know that I don't know Mandarin Chinese. I know that I don't know how to fly a helicopter. And I now know through experience that I should not be doing lobotomies. Right? So those are things that I know that I don't know how to do. And so I want you to quantify as much as you can the second piece of pie, because there will be a third piece of pie. All right? All right. So for me, this is the piece of pie that I know. I am aware of things that I don't know. I know I don't know these things. And I'm sure you have very similar things, things you don't know. So maybe it's quantum physics, or maybe it is how to change a tire. There are things that you are aware of that you do not know. So we have what we know, we have what we know we don't know, and we have the rest of this pie, which is what you don't know you don't know. But we'll refer to this as a blind spot. Blind spot. Or another way to talk about it is a scotoma, S-C-O-T-O-M-A. And that's the root word where we get the word glaucoma, right? Scotoma, blind spot. And so we have what we know, we have what we know we don't know, we have our blind spots. And what do you think is the biggest problem with this particular, let's refer to this as a worldview, all right? Or a paradigm, P-A-R-A-D-I-G-M, paradigm. And that's simply just the way you see the world, or a worldview, right? A paradigm, the way you see the world. And what's the biggest problem with this paradigm? It's full of a blind spot. The majority of it is a blind spot. Now, when you were a young child, whose responsibility was it to give you your first paradigm, your first way of looking at the world? your parents, your family, those folks who raised you. You know, it could be a foster parent or an adoptive parent, it could be a blood parent, but grandparents. But it was their responsibility to give you their paradigm. And so they gave you what they knew, they gave you what they knew they didn't know, and they gave you your blind spots. Now, as we look at this, where did they get their paradigm? Also from their parents, right? So we have a gift that keeps on giving. And so one of the things we have to recognize is that the paradigm that I have received came out of a particular context, right? Came out of a particular context. There are sayings that come out of a particular context. Fat meat is greasy comes out of a particular context. Some of the wisdom of those sayings kind of comes out of a particular context. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that context is constantly changing. So our paradigm must also change with it. So here's a story, and I know many of you have probably heard this story of three women in cooking a holiday meal. And one of the women was the youngest. She was the daughter of the middle woman. And so the daughter sees her mom cutting this turkey in half. And she's really disturbed by this process because, you know, it's not looking pretty. And so the daughter goes to the mom and says, "Mom, why are you cutting the turkey in half?" And so the mom gives her some lame story about it, tenderizing the turkey differently, that is engaging the juices or allowing them to flow different, and all this stuff. And the daughter's not buying it, so she keeps pressing the mom. And the mom gets frustrated, and she says, "You know what? Ask your grandmother why I'm doing this." And so the daughter goes over to the grandmother and says, "Grandmother, Mom is in the kitchen cutting this turkey in half." And the grandmother says, "No, she's not." And the daughter's like, "Yes, she is. And she told me to ask you why she's doing it." And the daughter, and the grandmother said, "Well, baby, she's doing it because that's what I used to do." Now the daughter's really perplexed. She's like, why does this seem to be a family tradition to butcher this turkey in this particular kind of way? And so the daughter asked, she said, "Grandmother, why did you do that?" And the grandmother looked at her and said, "Baby, that's the only way it would fit in the oven." Now, the mother now has an oven that is large enough to fit this turkey, but she's playing tapes from the past, not recognizing or knowing or even understanding why she's doing the things that she's doing. And so when we talk about this idea of a paradigm, oftentimes we operate, we think, we behave in a particular way, and we haven't even questioned or gotten an understanding as to why we do those things, right? So this sets up a paradigm for us that we already know that we may have some out of context problems. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of context. What is context? So context is time, geographic place, and the use of space. How do we use space, right? How do we use space? So space, we'll start there. In the country, space is used differently, or in rural areas, it's used differently than it is in the city, right? And so rural folks may feel crowded if they have neighbors that are within a mile of their house, right? Where in the city, folks may feel crowded or feel liberated to have a park that is, 1 square mile, right? They may feel liberated in that way. So space is important. Geographic place is important, right? Because that sets the context. Florida and Minnesota in the winter behave totally different given their context, right? And behavior here in Minnesota, given the context in the winter, requires that we get out into nature, but we're usually bundled up, right? We're doing ice fishing, we're doing polar bearing, we're cross-country skiing, where those kinds of things, because of the geographic place, can't happen in Florida in February. And then time. The generations, as generations tick on, there are advancements in technology, supposedly. There are new inventions. There are new ways or different ways of doing things. We move from postal or pony mail to postal mail, now to email, and to texting and all those advances in technologies. So as time changes, so does the context. So context is consistently and continually changing and moving. There are ways that we talk to each other today that we didn't talk to each other a long time ago, or a way that we used to talk a long time ago that we don't talk about or talk with people today, right? For example, Brazil nuts. There was a term, a slang term used for Brazil nuts. And Brazil nuts are those mahogany-looking nuts that are about like an orange wedge, but it's really hard and crinkly. And some of you know what I'm talking about when I talk about it, right? So one way that these Brazil nuts were described, the slang term was nigger toes. And we certainly don't call them that today. We call them Brazil nuts. And to be quite honest, I'm not even sure if they have really come from Brazil. So I have to check that out, right? But because of the time, the place, the space, because of the context shift, we no longer call them that because that would be disrespectful, right? So that's an important thing to talk about, this idea of context. Because context is everything. So let's talk a little bit about human needs, right? So we have this idea of context. So let's draw this diagram. So context is over here. So here's context. And context is time, place, and space. And here we'll have human needs. And what I would suggest is that human beings ultimately, so you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that they're usually come in a pyramid, and you see either 5 or 7, depending on what model you're using. But I would like to suggest that there's a more simple way to even think about humans' needs, right? So human beings are looking for safety, significance, and belonging. So significance would suggest that I'm a person with purpose and power. I can do something, and I like to contribute that and then be recognized for my contribution, right? So I am a person with purpose and power. I can do something. Everyone can be great because everyone can serve, as Dr. King often said, right? So this idea of significance, and the thing about significance is you can either determine what your significance is, or the universe will open that up for you, right? So you'll learn about what your significance is. And we're also looking for we're looking for significance, and we're looking to be in relationships. We're looking to belong. We're looking to be in relationships with people who understand our significance. And I would suggest that your friends probably recognize, the people you surround yourself with probably recognize your significance, oftentimes more so than your family does, right? So we're looking for significance. We're looking for this idea of belonging, which is to be in relationships with people who understand my significance. And we're looking for safety. We're looking to be physically, emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually safe to be in relationships with people who understand our significance. So we're looking for these three things through our basic human needs. All human beings are looking for these three things. And so when we talk about this idea of context, when we talk about this need for human beings, we may see a progression of things, because once we understand the context and we can see that this is what people are trying to get, then we start to understand how paradigms get formed, right? How paradigms get formed. And so what we call this idea, this way of seeing the world, or this approach to the world, we will call that culture. And culture is simply the adaptation to the context. Right? And this is where people make meaning of that adaptation. Yeah. Of that adaptation. They make meaning of that adaptation through two things. They create artifacts, and they attach those artifacts to values. So culture is the adaptation to the context that is trying to help human beings meet their needs. They're trying to meet their needs according to this context, right? So we have context, we have culture, we have human needs. And so artifacts become the physical manifestation of those values that have been adapted to meet human needs within the context. All right? Context is everything. And so if we understand that people are trying to get these things, so they develop culture to adapt to the context, then we have a better grasp on how and why people think and move in the world. The question we have to ask is, what context did that behavior, or why did they develop that behavior in the first place? And usually context will give us some clues about that, right? So that is that. And so when we talk about this idea of even cultural competence, what we're really talking about is understanding the balance between the culture, which is really the methods. We know what the why is, and this becomes the constraint of the context, right? So context, human needs, and culture. So when we talk about all of this stuff, so a paradigm becomes a particular method that a culture uses, right? So this culture, this way of seeing the world becomes one of these kind of cultural artifacts, if you will, right? So what beauty is, how beauty is established, what time is, how time is used or established. Are you on time? Are you in time? If I say be there at 7, does that really mean 9:30, right? You have friends like that, right? So yeah, so there is this idea that there's a connection between culture and your paradigm. Now, one of the things that we have to recognize with this paradigm, with all of the things that we know, that within this category of things that we know, there are social lenses that we are given our context. So we are given social lenses in a particular context. And so in the United States, some of those social lenses look like this concept of gender roles, right? So we have gender roles that become a lens. Racial identity becomes one of those roles. Economic status becomes one of those roles. Whether you're poor or rich or middle class, that becomes one of those lenses. Your ability to do things, so your physical ability. Are you limited, or do you have challenges? Are you using prosthetics? Do you use a wheelchair? So your ability to do things. And so what that does is, what that means for us is that we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are, right? We see the world. Where did his lips go? We see the world as we are, right? And so we're not necessarily seeing the so-called truth. We're seeing our perception or our reality as it's demonstrated in the world around us, right? So we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. When we talk about this idea of paradigm. So I want to go through just a quick exercise with you, and we have some people online as well, so we'll kick this out to them. But what I'd like for you to do right now is I want you to draw a bicycle. I want you to draw a bicycle as best you can, right? I'm not asking you to be a technical engineer or anything, but I want you to draw a bicycle, all right? Now, when you look at your bicycle, is it functional? Does it have everything that it needs, right? So here is an example of some of the basic functions of a bicycle. Right? Seat, handlebars, brakes in the back, backpack, whatever, pedals, spokes, chain, right? Functional bicycle. Oftentimes, we think that we know we think we know how things work, right? We think we know where we can find information or whatnot. But what we actually have is the illusion of knowledge. We have the illusion of knowledge. So someone asked me a question the other day, and I just responded with another question, right? I should have answered the question. Well, I kind of answered it with my question. So someone asked me, what happens when you drop a water droplet into a vacuum? That's what they asked me. And my response actually was quite genuine. I don't know, because I have never dropped a water droplet in a vacuum. Have any of you? No. Right. We have the illusion of knowledge, right? So this idea of the illusion of knowledge is that we think we know how things work. So for example, if your, as far as I'm concerned, your cell phones that we use, magic. Because I could, if all the pieces were laid out on a table and they said, put this phone together, I wouldn't be able to do it. I wouldn't be able to put it back together. Because I think I know how it works, but I really don't know how it works. Right? And so this illusion of knowledge has to be challenged, or at least recognized, or it continues to create blind spots for us. Right? We go back to the mother cutting the turkey in half because she's got this blind spot, this scotoma, and it's been formed by this illusion of knowledge. She thinks she knows how to cook turkey because she's seen it. And just because we've seen it doesn't necessarily mean that we know how to do that. There's a website for that called Pinterest Fails, right? Love looking at Pinterest Fails because there's the picture of the Pinterest where somebody's done something really cool, and then other people try to do it. Maybe they don't have the right resources or the skill level to do it the way the other person did, and they come out with something totally different. So I enjoy that particular website, watching that, because I oftentimes find that I think I know how to do something when in fact I don't. So this idea of knowing how stuff works. And how do you know what you know, even about yourself? And so another piece of this illusion of knowledge is this idea of conformity.
Conformity.
Right? Conformity. And conformity comes when we give up our power to the system, because either we believe that the power that the system understands, or we believe that the person in charge understands, that the person has our best interests at heart. We actually stand in the elevator and wait for someone else to push the button when we get to this piece of conformity. Now, one of the things that we have to recognize is that conformity is not bad. It is a tool that it should be a tool in your toolbox for navigating throughout the world. There are times then that it is best for me to achieve my goals, to conform to what's going around me. Now, I was in North Africa, Egypt particularly, and I'm walking around with some another group of Americans, and we're trying to, fit in as much as possible, given some of the tensions that people have throughout the world about what it means to be American. And so these rough kind of guys come up to our group and pinpoint me because of being African American. I stand out, right? So they come up to me and they ask me, "Are you American?" And they weren't asking nicely, right? I mean, it wasn't like it was like you could feel that, right? So there was some tension there, and so I looked at them and I said, "No, I'm Canadian." And they said, "Oh, Canada," right? I said, but that's not how they were coming to me. So some people will say, "Well, you should never deny what you say, what you want to say." I had some goals to get back to the United States, and so telling that extension of the truth allowed me to get back to the United States, right? So sometimes that conformity is good, but when you conform for the sake of conformity, or you don't even know why you're motivated to conform, or you may not even necessarily know that you've conformed, then that's where this blind spot or this scotoma can be difficult to unravel, can cause you problems and pain. So we have to understand that. And some signs that we're in conformity is when people say things like, "Do this because I said so," right? And that's the parents' national anthem, so to speak, right? Another is when people try to invoke unquestioned belief in something, right? So you should believe this just because I said so, just because everybody else does, just because blah, blah. And so I get really nervous when I hear people trying to shove those kinds of belief systems on people, particularly things around kind of this national identity, right? And so patriotism, I think oftentimes is a weapon that is used to villainize or separate the people it's supposed to unite. Right? So you're a patriot if you do ... You're not a patriot if you don't do ... Right? So I think that's interesting. I think right now there's this whole conversation about the national anthem, standing or kneeling or whatever. But I do find it interesting that most of the people who condemn athletes for whatever it is that the athletes are choosing to do hold those athletes in a state of high esteem, so high that they demand that those athletes do things that they won't do themselves, right? So people complain about people kneeling for the national anthem, but how many people watching at home stand up and put their hand over their heart, take off their hat, and salute the flag like they're demanding that other people do, right? So this idea of conformity, just for conformity's sake, can create these scotomas, these blind spots that can be very difficult to overcome. And yeah, so we get stuck in these ruts and we say, this is what people have always done. This is why we're doing it, and you should do it too. We know that we need to place things in a context. So the more we're able to understand the context, the more we're actually able to understand people's behaviors, their motivations, and ultimately we're able to understand our own behaviors. We have all been born out of a context, right? So I remember I was really excited. I wrote my first book. I was really proud of it. I was talking to my dad, and we don't talk that often or as often as we used to when I was a kid. And And so I was talking with him, and I told him how proud I was of my book. And he said, "Oh yeah, I wrote a book." And I said, "Really? I didn't know that you wrote a book." And so he said, "Yeah, I wrote a book." And so I went to Amazon and purchased his book. He was like, "I'll send you a copy." I said, "No, no, 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 no. I'll buy it. I'll just buy your book." So I got the book off Amazon. It comes to the house. I open it up and start reading it. And this dude stole a chapter out of my book. No, he didn't steal a chapter out of my book. I am my father's son. And although there were things that I did not remember, when I went to go write this book, there were lessons, there were stories that I got directly from my father that were a part of that became a part of who I am. Right? And so that's important to realize that context is everything. Context is everything. And so when we think about out of context problems, what we have are problems that we're not aware of, things that are not in our consciousness. And I don't mean to be dramatic, but this was something that really changed how America functioned, how the United States functions, which was September 11th, right? It was never in our consciousness that people, or at least the majority of us, could not imagine that people would use an airplane full of people as a missile, right? That was not something that was in our consciousness. And I would suggest to you that strategy will no longer work. Why? Because now that particular strategy is in our consciousness, right? It is in our context. We from underwear bombs to all sorts of creative ways to create mayhem and terror are now becoming a part of our consciousness. The civil rights movement was an example of things being out of context, and what we've recognized now is that water fountains can be used by all sorts of folks, right? And so there are also challenges in terms of some of the trans movement about what our context is, right? So where does that come out of, and what do we do with that as we move forward? Because we know that time, place, and space changes. Today's enemies in war will be tomorrow's friends, or at least allies in some shape, form, or another. We also recognize that human beings are, again, motivated by trying to accomplish safety, significance, and belonging, right? So that becomes important to remember when we're trying to put things in context. And we have to recognize that we can create new context. We get to create, so as the context changes, we create new cultures, new ways of being, right? So for example, what is the truth? What are facts? And what I would suggest to you is that facts are simply what we know today, the best of what we know today. And sometimes those facts change. So I was in sixth grade, took the test, and this was one of the questions on the test. How many, and this was in 1982, how many planets are there in the solar system? And in 1982, what was my answer? There were 9 planets in the solar system. You ask a young person today, how many planets are there in the solar system, and you will get 8. Most often you'll get 8. Why? Because Pluto is no longer a planet. The facts in 1982 were accurate. The facts today are very accurate, but the truth is very different. And sometimes we have to recognize that there's a difference between the truth and facts. Right? So facts are the things that we know today. And truth is the meaning that we make of the truths that we know today. And so that's important. It's also, to put things in context, it's also important to recognize that you need to be goal-oriented. You need to be goal-oriented. So when you start looking at your paradigms, challenging those things, or you challenge your culture, or you challenge this idea of conformity or this illusion of knowledge, you have to have a goal in mind for yourself and for the group or organization that you're leading as a leader, right? So what is the goal? And so that becomes the question when we start talking about this paradigm. So what is the goal of why I see the world this way? What is the goal for me to conform? What is the goal of this knowledge I supposedly have, right? Because that helps us to ultimately develop better cultural competence. And lastly, when we talk about this idea of putting things in context, it's important for us to act as if. Act as if. So if this is true, then what do I do? If this is not true, what do I do, right? But that goes right back to this idea of goal orientation. And so when we talk about this idea of out of context problems, what we have to realize that it becomes important for us to think about what our goals are. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And how do I eliminate these blind spots? And I eliminate these blind spots by being in relationships with other human beings, by developing friendships outside of my context, by looking for my blind spots. That's how I find them. Anyone drive a car? Does the car or the vehicle you've either driven or ridden in have blind spots? It certainly does. And those blind spots typically are kind of right behind the mirrors, right? Sometimes right behind the car, in some cases right in front of the car, depending on how big your car is. And if you have a Hummer, the whole thing is a blind spot, right? But is that blind spot your fault? And I would suggest that no, it's not your fault. But it is your responsibility. It is your responsibility. And so when we talk about this blind spot, this scotoma, what you know you don't know, and what your blind spots are not your fault because of how you were raised, the paradigm you were given. But now that you're at the age of accountability, it is now your responsibility to bring those things into your context. My name is Andre Koen. I want to thank you for your time today, and have a great day. Thanks.